On a warm June afternoon in 1983, Tracey Thurman lay bleeding in a friend's backyard in Torrington, Connecticut, her body punctured by 13 stab wounds, and she had a broken neck. Moments earlier, her estranged husband, Charles Buck Thurman, had chased her down, dragged her by the hair, and unleashed a frenzied attack in broad daylight. Neighbors screamed, and police officers stood just yards away. For a harrowing 27 minutes, Buck's rage ran its course unchecked. He stabbed Tracy again and again and again, and then he stomped on her head with heavy work boots, snapping her cervical vertebrae. As Tracy slipped towards unconsciousness, Buck disappeared into the house and returned holding their toddler son. And in a grotesque display, he dropped the little boy onto Tracy's limp, blood soaked body and snarled that he had killed your effing mother. Only then did the officer radio for an ambulance. Even as help belatedly arrived, Buck managed to kick his wife one more time and attempted to assault her inside the ambulance before finally police wrestled him to the ground and placed him under arrest. Tracey Thurman was thought to have died from that brutal assault, but she survived. However, her injuries were catastrophic. Doctors performed an emergency tracheotomy to help her breathing, and she spent 8 months in the hospital recovering. Parts of her body were left permanently paralyzed. She would forever walk with a limp and rely on mobility aids. Her face and back carried a lattice of scars, constant reminders of the violence she had endured. Yet, against all odds, Tracy's story did not end on that June day. In many ways, it was the beginning of a landmark fight for justice that would reverberate far beyond Torrington. And today, we are going to explore the bravery of this woman. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I am challenging myself to post 2 or 3 videos a week from now on, so if you like this sort of thing, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. I am so excited to tell Tracy's story. This woman changed the trajectory of how domestic abuse is handled. And although we have a really, really long way to go still to this day, without her bravery and her willingness to fight for justice, we wouldn't have made the progress that we have made in the last 40 years. So we really, really have Tracy to thank, and I'm so excited to share her story with you. Before we jump in, I just want to share that I am collecting once again Amazon wish lists from single parents. Now, I was raised by a single mother, so I know firsthand how stressful and difficult it can be to provide a great holiday season for your children. Especially now, it's even harder this year. So, if you are a single parent and you want any help or support in trying to make this holiday season really, really special for your young ones, please send your Amazon wish list to letfresherin@gmail.com, and I will feature it in one of my videos in November and early December. And hopefully, the lovely subscribers on the channel will want to open up their pocketbooks and purchase something from your Amazon wish list for you. Obviously, only if you have the means to do so, but I just think it's a really important time to provide support for those who might be struggling right now. Even if it's a gift card to Walmart so you can get groceries or clothing for your child, whatever it is, please send me your Amazon wish list to letfresherin@gmail.com. And without further ado, Let's jump in to Tracy's story, because what happened to her on that summer afternoon became one of the most influential DV cases in American history. Her desperate cries for help and the callous indifference with which authorities met them sparked a legal battle that would expose the glaring failures in the system. Thurman versus the city of Torrington would become a watershed civil rights case, holding police accountable for ignoring domestic abuse and establishing that battered women have the same right to protection as any other victims of violence. Tracy's ordeal and her courage in the face of it helped spur sweeping reforms, tougher laws, new police protocols, and a nationwide shift toward treating domestic violence as a serious crime rather than a private family matter. This is the story of Tracey Thurman, a young mother whose personal nightmare ignited a movement and changed the course of domestic law in America. Tracy's path to that fateful day in 1983 began innocently years earlier, with a chance meeting that felt like salvation. Tracy grew up in Torrington as a self-described mama's girl, utterly devoted to her mother. By 17, Tracy's world was shattered by her mother's unexpected death, a loss so devastating that she fled Connecticut to escape the pain. She headed south to Florida, alone and grieving, hoping distance might dull her sorrow. In Florida, she found a job cleaning rooms at a motel, and it was there in late 1980 that she met a young man named Charles Buck Thurman. Buck was in Florida with his family for a construction job. They were staying at the motel where Tracy worked. Now, he was a few years older, he was very confident and very attentive. So, to an 18-year-old girl reeling from loss, Buck felt like safe harbor. She says that when she met him, she felt so safe and secure, expressing that initially he seemed kind and protective. The two quickly became inseparable, and not long after, they were married and welcomed a baby boy, Charles Jr., nicknamed CJ. But those idyllic feelings didn't last long. The warning signs of Buck's temper emerged early, even before CJ was born. Tracy noticed that Buck had violent tendencies. He was prone to sudden fits of anger where he would punch walls and smash objects. She learned that domestic violence ran in his family. His own father had been an alcoholic who beat Buck's mother until a rehabilitation program set him straight. Buck was close to his mother, but he still carried the scars of an abusive childhood. So, understanding this, Tracy felt a deep well of sympathy for her husband. She said that it took her so long to leave because she knew what he had gone through as a child. She hoped that her love might heal his wounds. But when he raged and struck the walls in her home, she tried to dismiss it. She just thought, what a fool. She saw early red flags, but still felt obligated to support him. But as months passed, Buck's abusive behavior began to escalate from frightening outbursts to direct attacks. The couple had been married for less than 2 years, and their son was still a toddler when Tracy realized the violence was getting worse, not better. Buck's punches no longer landed on walls. They landed on Tracy. Each incident chipped away at her optimism that he would change. But still, she clung to hope. By then, she was a mother, and she believed that a boy needed his father. She also blamed herself, thinking that if she loved him enough or behaved differently, she could calm his temper. She said, I just thought that I could change him and the baby could change him. But nothing worked. Buck's violence only intensified, and Tracy's fear for her own life and her child's life began to eclipse her hope. Finally, sometime in mid-1982, Tracy made the agonizing decision to leave her husband for good. Gathering what courage she had left, 20-year-old Tracy fled back to her hometown of Torrington with little CJ in tow. In Torrington, they took refuge with Tracy's close friends, Judy Bentley and Rick St. Hilaire, who opened their home to the young mother and child. For the first time in years, Tracy felt some measure of safety. But Buck's fury followed close behind. He began harassing Tracy almost immediately after the separation, bombarding her with phone calls and threats. And Tracy tried to keep a low profile, but within 2 weeks, Buck discovered where she was staying. One night in October 1982, Buck showed up unannounced at the Bentley St. Hilaire house. When Judy and Rick briefly left the room, Buck seized the moment and lunged at Tracy, grabbing her. His voice was a vicious growl as he declared that no one else was going to raise his son. He pummeled Tracy before the horrified eyes of his young wife's friends. It took both Judy and Rick intervening to pull him off of her. They called the police 3 times that night in desperation, imploring authorities to come stop Buck's assault. By the time officers arrived, Buck was gone. He had fled, and he took little CJ with him in a chilling hostage-like gambit. Before racing off, he wrapped his hands around Tracy's throat and choked her, issuing a deadly ultimatum. If she dared involve the police, he would kill her. Tracy was left bruised, terrified, and temporarily childless until Buck eventually returned their son. It was the first of many times that she would try to file a formal complaint about Buck's violence, and the first of many times the response of police fell very short. Shaken and furious, Tracy and her friends went to the Torrington Police Department to report Buck's crime, and they expected the police to take action. After all, Buck had broken into their home, beaten Tracy, and kidnapped the child, and there were 2 witnesses who could attest to the story. Instead, they were met with indifference. An officer refused to even accept a complaint from Rick St. Hilaire about Buck's trespassing and assault in his home. This dismissive attitude would become a pattern. Over the coming months, no matter how grievously Buck threatened or harmed Tracy, Torrington's police would consistently minimize the situation as a domestic dispute, something best handled privately. It was an era when many police departments viewed domestic violence as a family squabble rather than a crime. Officers often aimed only to keep the peace temporarily, telling couples to work it out or cool off rather than making arrests. And we all know by now that majority of crime against women is at the hands of their loved one, aka their husband or their boyfriend or their partner or ex-partner, right? We are all aware of that. So there's just no excuse for police to ignore when a battered woman shows up to the station with 2 witnesses to corroborate her story. How horrifying is this? She almost died. She almost died. Tracey Thurman's pleas for protection were about to slip through the cracks of that system with nearly fatal consequences. In the fall of 1982, Tracey Thurman's life became a nightmare of stalking and fear, punctuated by frantic calls to the very police who seemed unwilling to help her. After the October attack, Buck Thurman showed no intention of leaving Tracy alone. Instead, his harassment escalated. He would materialize on the streets wherever Tracy went, watch her from a distance, and telephone her at all hours with menacing messages. Tracy lived in constant fear that Buck would make good on his threats to get her and end her life. Threats he voiced repeatedly to her and even others. In fact, Buck grew brazenly open about his intentions. While working days as a short order cook at Sky's Diner in Torrington, he told his regular customers, including local police officers who frequented the diner, that he planned to kill his wife, and he boasted about it as if it was a done deal. Sometimes he would even brandish a knife at the diner to illustrate his point, chilling those who heard him, but apparently not the police. Tracy did everything she could think of to save herself and her child. She filed formal complaints with the Torrington Police Department at every turn, each time begging them to arrest Buck before it was too late. But time after time, the police failed her. The assault at her friend's home in October had merely been the first instance. A timeline of Tracy's calls for help in the next 8 months leading up to the stabbing paints a damning picture of official neglect. We have the November 5th, 1982 attack, when Buck stormed into that residence and then snatched 1-year-old CJ by force. Then, a few days later, on November 9th, Buck tracked Tracy down on a public street. She was just sitting innocently in her parked car when Buck appeared and began screaming threats at her through the windshield. A Torrington police officer named Neil Gamelli was in the vicinity and just stood there watching while Buck shouted that he was going to hurt her. The officer only intervened when Buck's rage escalated to the point that he smashed in Tracy's windshield with his fist while she cowered inside the car. At that point, Buck was finally arrested. The next day, he was convicted of the misdemeanor charge of breach of the peace for breaking the car window. For breaking the car window. A friendly reminder that property is more valuable than a woman's life at this point. The consequences he faced were minimal. He had a suspended sentence of 6 months in jail and 2-year conditional discharge, which is a form of probation, on the condition that he stay away from Tracy and her friend's house. In essence, he basically walked free with a promise not to bother Tracy again. Torrington police and court officials considered the matter resolved for the time being, despite his history of violence. Now, by late 1982, early 1983, the ink barely dry on Buck's suspended sentence was when he started terrorizing Tracy again. On New Year's Eve, 1982, Buck showed up once more at the Bentley St. Hilaire home where Tracy was staying and threatened to harm her, a direct violation of the court order to stay away. Tracy frantically called the Torrington police to report that Buck was on her property again, pleading for them to arrest him for breaching the conditions of his release. The officer who took the call acknowledged that Buck was violating the court's order, yet no police car was dispatched. The police made, quote, no attempt to ascertain Buck's whereabouts or arrest him that night. Over the next few months, this pattern repeated itself countless times. Between January and May 1983, Tracy and others speaking on her behalf made numerous phone calls to Torrington police, reporting that Buck was continuing to threaten to kill her and their son. Each time, she explicitly warned that Buck was violating the law, both the conditional discharge from his earlier conviction and basic criminal laws against harassment and threats. Each time, Tracy begged the police to arrest her husband before he could carry out his threats. Each time, nothing happened. The police documented the calls in their logs, but no officer ever sought out Buck or took steps to enforce the law. As later court filings would note, Tracy's attempts to file complaints about Buck's threats of death and maiming were ignored or rejected by the police with virtual impunity. They just did not care. Now, in early May of 1983, after months of living under siege, Tracy's desperation reached new heights. On May 4th, 1983, she and her friend Judy Bentley went together to the police station to report the latest threat. Buck had said he was going to shoot and kill Tracy and Judy because she was helping Tracy. This was an outright death threat, a grave crime in itself, and a clear violation of Buck's probation terms. Officer John Storrs took down Tracy's written statement. She formally requested an arrest warrant for Buck on the basis of the death threat and his ongoing harassment. But even in this dire circumstance, the police found ways to slow walk the process. Officer Storrs refused to accept Judy Bentley's corroborating complaint about the threat to her life. Really there to protect and serve, isn't he? Storrs instructed Tracy to come back in 3 weeks on June 1st to follow up on the warrant application. It was a baffling delay given Buck's escalating behavior, but Tracy felt she had no choice to comply. So on May 6th, not willing to bet her life on the police alone, Tracy sought help from the courts directly. She went to the Litchfield Superior Court and filed for a restraining order against Buck. That same day, a judge granted an ex parte restraining order, forbidding Buck from assaulting, threatening, or harassing Tracy. The order was served to Buck, and Torrington police were notified of its existence. So now, if Buck even approached Tracy, he would be violating a court order, giving police yet another reason and obligation to arrest him. Tracy felt a flicker of hope that this piece of paper might finally force the authorities to intervene. By late May, Buck was undeterred by the restraining order. As Memorial Day weekend approached, he continued to menace Tracy. On May 27, 1983, Tracy was so frightened that she requested a police escort just to travel to the police station for another attempt at obtaining the arrest warrant against Buck. An officer did drive her to the station, but once again, she hit a wall of delay. Tracy was informed that with the long holiday weekend, nothing could be done immediately. She was told to come back after Memorial Day to pursue the warrant. May 31st, on the Tuesday after the holiday, a weary Tracey Thurman showed up at the police department yet again to ask if an arrest warrant for Buck had been issued. This time, an officer told her that the only person who could help her was Officer Storrs, who had taken her statement earlier, but Storrs was on vacation. Incredibly, she was instructed that she'd have to wait until stores returned from vacation for any further action. Tracy was beside herself. She had already waited the 3 weeks store had asked for, and Buck's threats were looming larger every single day. To buy yet more time, the police effectively shut her down. That same day, Tracy's brother in law, furious at the delays, called the police on her behalf to protest the inaction. A police official told him that they planned to arrest Buck on June 8th. And it was another promise that would not be kept, because June 8th came and went with no arrest made. Throughout these months, the Torrington officers on the force, nearly 30 of them, were well aware of Buck Thurman's reign of terror. Many had heard his threats firsthand at the diner. Others had taken Tracy's desperate calls or read the reports. Yet, not one officer stepped up to take decisive action. Their inaction conveyed a deadly message to Tracy. You're on your own. Unbeknownst to her at the time, Tracy's experience was not unique. Police around the country often failed to take domestic violence seriously, treating battered women as second-class victims. In one police chief's frank admission, departments then frequently regarded domestic abuse as less serious than other assaults. They would respond with half measures, if at all, as long as the violence was between spouses or intimate partners. Tracey Thurman, however, was about to expose the tragic cost of that indifference in the most dramatic way possible. On June 10th, just 2 days after the police failed to arrest Buck, Tracey Thurman's worst nightmare came true. It was early afternoon when Buck Thurman arrived at the Bentley St. Hilaire house yet again, this time seething with a new level of determination. He had evaded arrest for months despite restraining orders and warrants in progress, and he seemed convinced of his own impunity. Buck pounded on the door and demanded to see Tracy, shouting for his wife to come outside. Inside, Tracy's heart leapt into her throat at the sound of Buck's voice. She immediately dialed the Torrington police. This was a direct violation of Buck's probation and the restraining order, exactly the scenario she had warned officers about multiple times. Tracy implored the dispatcher, "Please send help now. He's trying to get in." She was told an officer was on the way. 15 minutes passed, and no one arrived. Buck's fury escalated outside, and Tracy feared he would break in or find their son. Desperate to keep the situation from exploding, Tracy made a fateful choice. She stepped outside onto the porch to confront Buck herself. Perhaps she thought she could calm him down or stall him until the police got there. Perhaps he wouldn't hurt her with the neighbors as witnesses. Perhaps she prayed the officers would pull up in the driveway any second. But the moment Buck saw Tracy emerge, his rage detonated. He lunged at her, and Tracy turned to run, but Buck caught her by the hair, yanked her backwards, and threw her into the ground in the front yard. In his hand glinted a knife. Tracy tried to scream, but Buck was already upon her. He began stabbing her mercilessly, driving the blade into her chest, her neck, and her throat over and over again. Tracy's white blouse turned crimson as she absorbed stab wound after stab wound, 13 in all. She tried to crawl away, but Buck straddled her, continuing to plunge the knife in. The attack spilled into the backyard, fully visible to horrified bystanders and neighbors. It was around this moment, approximately 25 minutes after Tracy's initial call for help, that a Torrington police cruiser finally pulled up to the scene. Officer Frederick Petrovitz stepped out, and what he encountered was a scene of pure horror. Buck Thurman standing over Tracy's prone body, a blood-soaked knife in hand, and a small crowd of screaming witnesses. According to later testimony, Officer Petrovitz hesitated, unsure how to react. Buck dropped the knife to the ground as the officer approached, but the danger was far from over. While Petrovitz looked on, Buck viciously kicked the downed Tracy in the head, as if to emphasize his dominance over her. The boot to her skull made a sickening thud. Inside Tracy's neck, her cervical spine fractured under the force. And in an instant, she lost all feeling in most of her body. Her spinal cord had been severely damaged. Tracy was now motionless, bleeding profusely and gravely injured, right at that officer's feet. And then, finally, the officer took action. But arguably, he did the bare minimum. He picked up Buck's bloody knife, pocketed it as evidence, but didn't handcuff or restrain Buck. Petrovitz would later claim in court that he hadn't realized Tracy was lying critically wounded on the ground. He said he hadn't seen a body. You didn't see a body, bro? And for all he knew, Buck might have stabbed like a dog or a chicken. Oh, so that's how bloody her body was? That's how broken down she was that you couldn't even recognize her as human? Give me a break. It was a dubious assertion given the obvious scene. But in that moment, Petrovitz indeed failed to render aid or subdue the attacker. Buck Thurman, unbelievably, was left to roam free with an officer on site. So what happens next defies belief, because enraged and adrenaline fueled, Buck dashed into the house and seconds later reemerged carrying 2-year-old CJ, who had been napping inside. In front of neighbors and the officer, Buck dropped the crying child onto his mother's limp body on the grass. Tracy, semi-conscious, could only gurgle in pain as her son landed on her. Buck leaned down and in a chilling voice told the toddler, "Look at your mother. I killed your mother." He then gave Tracy another savage kick to the head. Blood poured from her mouth and her neck. And by now, neighbors had formed a crowd around the perimeter, screaming at the officer to do something. Around 40 minutes after Tracy's initial call, additional police reinforcements finally began to arrive. Officers D'Angelo, Newkirk, and Columbia pulled up, joining Petrovitz at the chaotic scene. One might expect that with multiple officers present, they would immediately tackle and arrest Buck, who was still menacingly pacing near Tracy. But instead, the officers first focus on getting medical help for Tracy, a triage decision that actually might have been understandable given her dire state, but it left Buck disturbingly free to roam among the crowd. Paramedics arrived with an ambulance and rushed to stabilize Tracy, whose vital signs were fading. According to witnesses, the police initially even blocked the paramedics from assisting until they themselves had moved Tracy onto a stretcher. Like, why are you doing the opposite things of what you are supposed to do? Buck was still not in custody during these critical minutes. So as Tracy is being lifted onto the stretcher, Buck seized one last opportunity to attack. With a crazed look, he suddenly lunged toward the ambulance, attempting to climb inside it to get at Tracy for a third time. Only then did the police finally act decisively. This makes me so angry. The group of officers finally swarmed Buck and wrestled him to the ground, subduing him at last. Buck Thurman was placed in handcuffs and put under arrest nearly half an hour after Officer Petrovitz first arrived, and after an unthinkable series of additional assaults that had taken place right under law enforcement's nose. Serve and protect my ass. Tracey Thurman was rushed to the hospital, clinging to life. She had deep stab wounds to her chest and her neck, a concussion, and a broken, fractured vertebrae that had severed part of her spinal cord, causing partial paralysis. In the emergency room, doctors cut open her throat for a tracheotomy to allow her to breathe through a tube. She flatlined twice on that operating table, but was resuscitated. For the first 2 months, Tracy remained in critical condition, unable to speak due to the tube and fighting for her life. Little CJ, thankfully unharmed physically, was kept away from the ICU where his mother lay covered in bandages and machines. But miraculously, Tracy survived those early weeks. Her recovery was slow and painful. She would spend a total of 8 months in the hospital before she was well enough to go home. When she finally did return home in a wheelchair, her toddler son didn't recognize her at first. The trauma of seeing his mother grievously wounded had scarred him. Quote, "When I first came home, he spit at me and cried that he wanted his old mommy back." It's just heartbreaking. It's incredibly damaging to that relationship. It's just an added layer of trauma for both of them. Imagine surviving a brutal attack, one that you knew was going to happen, one that you begged the police to prevent. And now your own child, who you tried to save, is telling you that he wants his old mommy back. And I'm sure in the back of her mind, she's like, I want my own self back. She's paralyzed now. She's forever changed. This mother and child had been separated for so long, and Tracy's appearance had changed so drastically. She was pale, scarred, moving slowly and gingerly in her wheelchair. It took time and gentle reassurance for her son to understand that this was indeed his mother and that she was healing. Her own physical scars were severe. Those 13 stab wounds left permanent marks across her chest and neck. A long surgical scar slashed across her throat from the tracheotomy. Due to her spinal cord injury, Tracy's right side was partially paralyzed. She eventually regained the ability to walk short distances, but only with difficulty. Her right leg remained weak and prone to dragging. She couldn't fully use her right arm or hand, and she lost a lot of her fine motor skills. On her left side, she lost sensation in her fingertips and from her knee down to her toes. In effect, more than half of Tracy's body never fully recovered from the assault. She underwent grueling physical therapy several times a week, striving to strengthen whatever muscles she could and adapt to her disabilities. Quote, I can lose what I have gained, so I go 3 days a week to therapy, she said, describing how she pushed herself to maintain mobility. The doctors told her that she'd reached a plateau in her recovery. Paralysis beyond a point would be permanent. She was then at a standstill, though she refused to give up and still would strive for small improvements. Beyond those physical injuries, the emotional trauma loomed large. Tracy suffered nightmares and anxiety, haunted by flashbacks of Buck's attack. Her young son bore invisible wounds. Even as he grew, the events of June 10th would cast a long shadow. One day, a few years later, little CJ accidentally viewed a videotape of an ABC 2020 TV segment about his mother's case, which Tracy had recorded in 1986. The program, titled Please, Somebody Help Me, recounted the brutal attack and included interviews with Tracy, her friends, and even one police official acknowledging how poorly domestic violence cases were handled. Seeing this, CJ became extremely upset and angry. For a long time afterward, he wanted to go after his father, Tracy said. The little boy fantasized about somehow punishing Buck for what happened. Tracy faced the heartbreaking task of calming her son's vengeful feelings. Quote, it's so hard to tell my son about it, she said, but I don't want to teach him that you take the law into your own hands, unquote. Inwardly, Tracy understood his anger all too well, but she was determined that CJ not grow up poisoned by the cycle of violence. As Tracey Thurman struggled to piece her life back together, one thing became crystal clear to her. The system had utterly failed to protect her when she needed it the most. She'd done everything a victim is supposed to do. She had fled her abuser, sought help from law enforcement, obtained court orders, and she was still nearly killed. Lying in her hospital bed, partially paralyzed, Tracy's sorrow and fear slowly hardened into resolve. If the police and city authorities thought they could shrug off what happened to her, they were about to learn otherwise. Tracey Thurman was not going to stay silent. With the help of an intrepid lawyer, she set out to hold the city of Torrington accountable in court, and in doing so, she would make legal history. In April 1984, less than a year after the attack, Tracy took the remarkable step of filing a federal lawsuit against the city of Torrington and its police officers. At the time, Tracy was a 22-year-old single mother still recovering from paralysis, but she was determined to seek justice beyond the criminal case against Buck, who, incidentally, would be convicted of assault and sentenced to 20 years, of which he ultimately served less than 8 of those years. He served less than 8 for attempted murder. Her lawsuit, Thurman versus the city of Torrington, alleged that Torrington's police department had violated her civil rights through its systemic failure to protect her from domestic violence. Specifically, Tracy claimed the police had denied her equal protection of the laws, treating her domestic abuse complaints as unworthy of the same attention and protection afforded to other crime victims. At first blush, Tracy's legal action was groundbreaking. She became the first woman in America to sue a town and its police department for failing to protect her from domestic violence. Her attorney, Burton M. Weinstein, assisted by Judith Mazalka, crafted the case under 42 U.S.C. 1983, a federal civil rights statute that allows citizens to sue government officials for depriving them of constitutional rights. The heart of Tracy's argument was that Torrington's police, by repeatedly ignoring her pleas solely because because the threats came from her husband, had created a de facto policy of discrimination against battered women. In other words, the lawsuit asserted that women in domestic violence situations were being treated as a lower class of citizen by police, denied the protection anyone else would receive. This was framed as a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, which guarantees that no state shall deny any person equal protection of the law. The city of Torrington fought back hard. Its lawyers filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that Tracy's complaint failed to state a constitutional claim. They contended, in effect, that the Equal Protection Clause didn't apply because the police hadn't intentionally discriminated against Tracy on the basis of a protected category like race. No, they just said, "You're a woman, you're getting beat up at home. Not my circus, not my monkeys. Give me a break." In their view, police negligence or nonfeasance in a domestic dispute, while perhaps regrettable, was not a constitutional matter. The city's brief even suggested that equal protection covered only things like racial discrimination, not how police allocate resources for different crimes. This was a common mindset in many official circles at the time. The notion that victims of, quote, wife beating, unquote, had no constitutional right to police protection and certainly no rights to sue if the cops dropped the ball. In October 1984, the case landed before senior U.S. District Judge M. Joseph Blumenfeld, a veteran federal judge known for his integrity. Judge Blumenfeld issued a pivotal ruling that denied the city's motion to dismiss, allowing Tracy's case to move forward. In his decision, Blumenfeld made several key findings that gave legal weight to Tracy's claims. Equal protection applies beyond race. Blumenfeld firmly rejected the city's narrow view of the Equal Protection Clause. He wrote that it was, quote, clearly a misstatement of the law, unquote. To say that equal protection only forbids racial discrimination is basically a joke. The judge noted that the clause has been applied to strike down government actions discriminating on other bases, such as sex or illegitimacy, when no sufficient state interest justifies it. This opened the door to police viewing bias in responding to domestic violence as a form of sex-based or at least status-based discrimination. Judge Blumenfeld recognized that Tracy's ordeal was not an isolated incident, but the result of an ongoing pattern and practice by the police. Tracy's complaint had meticulously documented 8 months of police inaction in the face of her repeated reports. From that particularized pleading, the judge said, quote, a pattern emerges that evidences deliberate indifference on the part of the police department to Tracy's complaints and its duty to protect her, unquote. This pattern of deliberate indifference could be construed as an unofficial custom or policy of the city, even if not formally adopted, to deny full protection to victims of domestic abuse. Under the Supreme Court's precedent in Monell versus Department of Social Services, a city can be held liable for civil rights violation that stem from an official policy or well-settled custom. Tracy's case, Blumenfeld found, alleged exactly such a custom, a pattern or practice of affording inadequate protection or no protection at all to women who have complained of being used by their husbands, unquote. This unofficial policy was known to the officers and was, quote, the basis on which they ignored, unquote, Tracy's many pleas for help. In a powerful statement, the judge likened the months of inaction capped by the single brutal stabbing incident to a chain showing the city's responsibility. Even one especially brutal incident, he noted, can suggest a link between violation of constitutional rights and a pattern of police misconduct, if it is the predictable climax of that pattern. Thus, Tracy's claim that the city had a custom of tolerating domestic violence could not be dismissed out of hand. The core constitutional issue came down to differential treatment. Tracy's team argued that she was treated differently by police because her assailant was her husband, in contrast to how police would protect someone attacked by a stranger. Judge Blumenfeld found this theory plausible. In his ruling, he cited that Tracy's allegation that Torrington officials had long condoned a pattern of failing to protect women from domestic abuse. If proven, he reasoned, that could indeed amount to a violation of equal protection. He highlighted a pattern of affording inadequate protection or no protection at all to women who have complained of being used by their husbands is tantamount to an administrative classification used to implement the law in discriminatory fashion, unquote. In other words, if a police department by custom responds differently to a violent domestic assault than to a violent non-domestic assault, that's discrimination. It means Tracey Thurman, as a woman and as a wife reporting violence, was effectively denied the equal protection of the laws. So, with the motion to dismiss denied, Thurman versus City of Torrington proceeded towards trial. The case sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles. Never before had an entire police department been on the verge of standing trial for systematically failing a battered woman. Tracy's lawsuit named 29 Torrington officers as defendants, including everyone who had ignored or mishandled her complaints. At its peak, the Torrington Police Department had only about 40 officers, meaning a majority of the force was implicated. The city's legal team no doubt realized that a public trial could be enormously damaging, both financially and to their reputation, especially as Tracy's story was already attracting press attention. And indeed, the case did garner national attention. Advocates for victims and survivors of domestic violence were watching closely, as were other cities quietly worried that they might face similar liability. Battered women across the country saw Tracy as a hero for daring to challenge the long held notion that wife beating was a family affair beyond the reach of the law. In 1985, before the case reached a full jury trial, the city of Torrington effectively conceded defeat. Tracy won a landmark settlement holding the city to account. A federal jury, or by some accounts the judge in an advisory capacity, assessed damages, and Tracy was initially awarded $2.3 million for the violation of her civil rights. Torrington's lawyers began the process of appeal, but ultimately the city decided to settle rather than prolong the battle. To avoid further appeals, Tracy agreed to a final settlement of $1.9 million, which the city would pay. At the time, the sum was one of the largest payouts ever in domestic violence-related lawsuit and a stark rebuke to the city's negligence. Judge Blumenfeld's findings and the outcome of the case sent an unequivocal message. Law enforcement agencies could be held liable if they abandon a battered woman to the terror of an abusive spouse. As the judge succinctly put it, quote, such inaction on the part of the officer is a denial of the equal protection of the laws, unquote. Torrington learned this the hard way, and the news made headlines nationwide. The popular press widely reported on Tracy's victory and the hefty financial penalty the city had to pay. At a time when few victims of domestic violence ever saw their abusers even prosecuted, this civil court triumph was extraordinary. It established that the duty of police to protect applies to all citizens, including those terrorized by someone they know. In one summary of the case later noted, Tracy was discriminated against because the violence was a domestic dispute, whereas police protection was fully afforded in analogous situations not involving domestic relationships. Tracey Thurman had pierced the centuries-old shield of spousal abuse being a private matter. Her case stood as an official recognition that domestic violence victims deserve and are entitled to equal protection under the law. The impact of Thurman versus City of Torrington was not confined to the courtroom or to Torrington alone. It became a catalyst for widespread reform, influencing legislation, police practices, and public consciousness around domestic violence. In the wake of Tracy's legal victory, the question was, would the hard-won lessons of her case translate into the concrete change that could save the next woman in her situation? The Thurman Law and a new era in domestic violence policing. Tracey Thurman's case struck a national nerve, coming at a time when awareness of domestic violence was beginning to enter the mainstream. The dramatic news of a $1.9 million settlement for a battered woman, essentially penalizing an entire police department for failing to protect her, put municipalities everywhere on notice. Police chiefs and city attorneys realized that ignoring domestic violence could now carry huge legal and financial risk. The year after the case concluded, an Associated Press article about Buck Thurman's parole noted that Tracy's lawsuit and large settlement had changed the way police handled domestic complaints nationwide. Police departments, spurred by financial fear as well as growing public outrage, began to revise their policies and training regarding domestic disputes. Nowhere was the impact more direct and immediate than in Tracy's home state of Connecticut. Embarrassed by the Thurman case and pressed by advocates, Connecticut lawmakers moved quickly to strengthen domestic violence protections. In 1986, just 3 years after Tracy was stabbed and 1 year after her legal victory, The state passed a sweeping law called the Family Violence Prevention and Response Act. Nicknamed the Thurman Law, this legislation was explicitly crafted in response to the Thurman case. It fundamentally changed how police and courts in Connecticut dealt with domestic abuse. Key provisions of the law in 1986 included mandatory arrest, which was perhaps one of the most influential aspects. It was this requirement that police must make an arrest when responding to a domestic violence call if there is probable cause to believe an assault or other abuse has occurred. Crucially, this applied even when the victim didn't want to press charges. Before, officers often refrained from arresting abusers if the victim was hesitant or if it seemed like a quote family matter. The Thurman Law ended that discretion. It told police if you see signs of violence or court order is violated, you will arrest the offender. In effect, domestic violence was to be treated as any other crime, the very principle Tracy had fought for. Connecticut's approach was soon known as a mandatory arrest policy, and it became a model that many other states followed in the late 1980s. The law also established better procedures for courts to handle these cases. It created domestic violence units within the court system and required that after a domestic violence arrest, a hearing before a judge must occur within 24 hours to address the issue of restraining orders and offender release conditions. The aim was to ensure that abusers couldn't just spend a night in jail and return back home to terrorize their victims. A judge would have the chance to impose or extend a protective order very quickly after an incident. While the initial 1986 statute didn't explicitly spell out primary aggressor rules, leading to an unintended rise in dual arrests, it did prohibit police from using mutual arrest threats to discourage calls. In other words, officers could no longer tell a frightened victim, if we come, we'll just arrest both of you, so maybe you don't want us involved. The Thurman Law also pushed police departments to retrain their officers on domestic violence response. It also encouraged the development of victim support services like shelters and counseling referrals as part of the standard procedure when a domestic incident occurred. In Torrington, for example, by the late 1980s, the police were working more closely with local domestic violence hotlines and counselors, a far cry from the time when Tracy's complaints were just ignored. The results in Connecticut were dramatic. Arrest rates for domestic violence skyrocketed after the law took effect. Police who once left abusers with a warning were now hauling them to jail on the spot. In the decades after, advocates nationwide observed a similar trend. As states adopted pro-arrest or mandatory arrest policies, domestic violence arrest increased sharply. By 1988, just a couple years after Connecticut's law, about 90% of large police departments around the country had implemented some form of mandatory arrest policy, up from only 10% at the start of the decade. Clearly, a major shift was underway, and Tracey Thurman's case has often been cited as a catalyst. There were, however, some unintended consequences to these changes as well. One issue that emerged, particularly in Connecticut, was the phenomenon of dual arrests, police arresting both the abuser and the victim. Because the law didn't initially spell out how to identify a primary aggressor, some officers would then take the path of arresting everyone involved if each accused the other, which led to victims like Sana Dilawar in Torrington being arrested alongside their abusers, even when it was clear they acted in self-defense. During 2011 through 2015, Connecticut had dual arrests in an astonishing 18% of domestic violence incidents where an arrest was made, compared to a national average of around 2%. Advocates argued that this zero-tolerance approach had overcorrected, at times punishing victims and deterring them from calling for help. In essence, while mandatory arrest saved many women from further harm, it also revealed the need for more nuanced training, specifically teaching police to determine the primary aggressor so that victims who fight back aren't treated like criminals. Connecticut eventually addressed this by amending its laws. In 2018, the state passed a bill requiring officers to distinguish the dominant aggressor, aiming to cut down on dual arrests. But that's so late in the game, right? That didn't happen for 30 years. But this development does kind of support that the work Tracy's case started is ongoing. Policies are continuously being refined to really try to help survivors. But the consensus is that the Thurman case and the ensuing reforms have saved countless lives. Domestic homicide rates began to decline modestly in the 1990s, a change that is often attributed in part to better law enforcement response and the increased use of restraining orders and shelter services. It's really impossible to tally how many violent episodes were prevented because of an offender being arrested earlier or a victim who felt empowered to seek help, but experts do believe that the changes Tracy helped spark made a significant difference. Beyond the laws themselves, there's also a broader cultural shift. Domestic violence was dragged into the spotlight of public consciousness. The media played a big role in that shift, using Tracy's story to illustrate the issue. In January 1986, ABC's 2020 news magazine aired the segment, Please, Somebody Help Me, bringing Tracy's ordeal to a national TV audience. Viewers saw Tracy, soft spoken, partially paralyzed, but resolute, recount how her screams to the police went unanswered. They heard from her friends, from eyewitnesses, and even from a neighboring town's police chief who acknowledged the problem of treating domestic calls as low priority. The segment was jarring and eye opening for many Americans who had never considered that a woman could be left to be nearly killed despite dozens of calls to the police. Then in 1989, Tracy's story was dramatized in a made for TV movie that brought the issue into millions of living rooms. NBC aired A Cry for Help, the Tracey Thurman story, starring actress Nancy McKeon as Tracy and Dale Midriff as Buck. The film depicted the abuse and the negligence step by step, following Tracy's experience closely. Screenwriter Beth Sullivan worked from Tracy's own accounts and court transcripts. When the movie aired on October 2nd, 1989, it garnered high ratings and intense emotional reactions. Viewers were horrified at the violence, but inspired by Tracy's courage and ultimate victory. The Washington Post noted the movie stemmed directly from Tracey Thurman's own story and aimed to show how her lawsuit left a lasting legacy. In 1994, Congress passed the landmark Violence Against Women Act, the VAWA, which provided federal funding for domestic violence shelters, law enforcement training, and related programs. The act was part of a wave of acknowledgement that domestic violence is a serious crime with broad social impact, a wave that Tracy's story helped to swell. Looking back, legal scholars note that Thurman versus City of Torrington became a touchstone in domestic violence law. It's been discussed in countless law review articles, cited in textbooks on criminal justice and women's studies, and it's remembered as a pivotal point when domestic abuse stopped being brushed aside by authorities. In the years since the attack and the lawsuit, Tracey Thurman, now Tracey Thurman Matozic, after marrying a caring man named Michael, has lived the life she only once dreamed of during her darkest days. She raised her son CJ, who grew up understanding more about what happened, and by all accounts, did not follow in his father's violent footsteps. In fact, Tracy broke the cycle. She remarried in 1986 to Michael, a carpenter who fell in love with her after meeting through mutual friends. Michael's unwavering support and kindness were a stark contrast to Buck's. He said, "Everyone says she's lucky to have me, but I'm the one who's lucky." They've been married for over 3 decades now, building a quiet life together in Connecticut. Tracy has largely stayed out of the limelight, but she has never stopped speaking out against domestic violence when it counts. Even though she admits it's emotionally difficult, Tracy's given talks at women's shelters and survivor groups, sharing her story to help others. She says, "I will speak about this so others can be helped." Local organizations in Connecticut have recognized Tracy as a hero and a crusader. In 2018, the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence honored Tracy with a Coalition Crusader Award for her decades of advocacy and for the way her experience and action forever changed the landscape of domestic violence. It's truly a heroic story, and I admire Tracy for all she went through. It's truly, truly incredible when you sit back and think about the sheer bravery and determination it must have taken her to move forward and fight what would feel like a Goliath. It's truly remarkable. And I know we still have such a long way to go when it comes to domestic violence, but it just takes brave women, really. It takes brave women to make this kind of change. And I really, really believe that we can. So Let me know what you think below. Thank you so much for joining me on this story today. If you have a survivor story you'd like to share with me, I'm starting my new series next month where I share true, real stories of survival, whether it's from within a cult or a DV situation, or even if your family is or has been abusive. I would really love to hear for you. I will be happy to share your story anonymously. You just never know when sharing your story will either A, be really cathartic for you, but B, show others there's light at the end of the tunnel and show others red flags. I really want to support as many of you as I can. So if there are resources you believe I should be better at sharing on my channel, please share them in the comments below or email me those at letfresharin@gmail.com. And with all of that being said, thank you so much for being here today. And remember that you deserve to be treated well. So, like I always say, stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. I'll see you in my next video soon. Thanks y'all so much. Bye.